John Updike, Part 1. No Way. Review of Terrorist by John Updike. The Atlantic, June 2006. In 1978, just as I was beginning to become intrigued by the nascent menace of Islamist fanaticism, I read John Updike's novel The Coup. Set in the fictional African state of Kush, a Chad-like vastness dominated by a demagogue named Hakim Elulu, it took its author far from the Pennsylvania suburbs and car lots, and indeed offered, through the hoarse voice of Elulu, a highly dystopian view of them. What does the capitalist infidel make, you may ask, of the priceless black blood of Kush? Elulu asks, and then answers his own question. He extracts from it, of course, a fuel that propels him and his overweight, quarrelsome family, so full of sugar and starch their faces fester, back and forth on purposeless errands and ungratefully received visits. Rather than live as we do in the same village with our kin and our labour, the Americans have flung themselves wide across the land which they have buried under tar and stone. They consume our blood also in their factories and skyscrapers, which are ablaze with light throughout the night. I have visited this country of devils, and can report that they make from your sacred blood slippery green bags in which they place their garbage, and even the leaves that fall from their trees. They make of petroleum toys that break in their children's hands, and hair curlers in which their obese brides fatuously think to beautify themselves while they parade in supermarkets, buying food wrapped in transparent petroleum and grown from fertilizers based upon your blood. Of your blood they make deodorants to mask their God-given body scents, and wax for the matches to ignite their death-dealing cigarettes, and more wax to shine their shoes while the people of Kush tread upon the burning sands barefoot. I marked this passage at the time, thinking that I might one day want to refer to it. The two elements that it contains, apart from the actual commingling of oil and blood, are of some interest. The first is a sort of ventriloquization of Muslim rage, with care taken to give this an element of social gospel as well as Quranic puritanism. The second is an intellectual and aesthetic disgust, somewhat reminiscent of the more literary passages of John Kenneth Galbraith's Affluent Society, with the grossness and banality of much of American life. This was quite prescient. It had anticipated some of the rhetorical tropes of Muslim self-pity with which we've since become so familiar. Only Monica Ali, in Brick Lane, has caught the same tone of pseudo-socialist populism, and in her novel the crucial speech is delivered after the aggression of September the 11th, 2001. On that day, Updike happened to be looking at Manhattan from just across the river in Brooklyn Heights, and later described what he saw in a Talk of the Town essay in The New Yorker, in which he wrote, inter alia, "Determined men who have transposed their own lives to a martyr's afterlife can still inflict an amount of destruction that defies belief. War is conducted with a fury that requires abstraction, that turns a plane full of peaceful passengers, children included, into a missile the faceless enemy deserves. The other side has the abstractions. We have only the mundane duties of survivors." Perhaps feeling that this was somewhat inert, not to say pathetic, Updike then inserted a rather unconvincing note of stoicism, urging his readers to fly again on planes, since, guess what? Risk is a price of freedom, and issuing what was by comparison a bugle call. Walking around Brooklyn Heights that afternoon, as ash drifted in the air and cars were few and open-air lunches continued as usual on Montague Street, renewed the impression that with all its failings, this is a country worth fighting for. Understatement could do no more. Was it the ash, or the absence of cars, or maybe those tempting al fresco snacks that, America's manifold failings notwithstanding, straightened the Updike spine? Taking time to let his manly reflections mature and ripen in the cask, Updike has now given us Terrorist, another vantage point from which to view Manhattan from across the water. His terrorist is a boy named Ahmad, living in today's New Prospect, New Jersey, for whom the immolation of 3,000 of his fellow citizens is by no means enough. For him, only a huge detonation inside the Lincoln Tunnel will do. Let's grant Updike credit for casting his main character against type. Ahmad is not only the nicest person in the book, but is as engaging a young man as you could meet in a day's march. Tenderly, almost lovingly, Updike feels and feels like a family doctor until he can detect the flickering pulse of principle that animates the would-be martyr. Once again, obesity and consumerism and urban sprawl are the radix malorum. At the seaside. Devils. The guts of the men sag hugely, and the monstrous buttocks of the women seesaw painfully as they tread the boardwalk in swollen sneakers. A few steps from death, these American elders defy decorum and dress as toddlers. Whereas, in the schools, they think they're doing pretty good with some flashy, trashy new outfit they bought at half price, or the latest hyper-violent new computer game, or some hot new CD everyone has to have, or some ridiculous new religion when you've drugged your brain back into the Stone Age. It makes you wonder if people deserve to live seriously. If the massacre masterminds in Rwanda and Sudan and Iraq didn't have the right idea. The speaker in this latter instance is Jack Levy, a burned-out little Jewish man with a wife named Beth, a whale of a woman giving off too much heat through her blubber. He has ended up as the guidance counselor at uninspired New Prospect Central High, while his missus piles on the fat in front of the TV. Fortunately, though, she has a sister who works for the Secretary of Homeland Security, and who, though she rightly regards her corpulent New Jersey sibling as a moron, keeps calling her up to tell her absolutely everything about the nation's anti-terrorist secrets. This, too, is fortunate, because although he doesn't yet know it, the irony, Jack Levy has a massacre mastermind in his own school right under his nose. I've just flipped through the book again to be quite certain that I didn't make any of this up. Young Ahmad, who has an absent Muslim father and a ditzy and whorish Irish mother, who probably has red hair and freckles and green eyes, I honestly couldn't be bothered to go back and double-check that, is quite a study. With such a start in life, who wouldn't start hanging around the mosque and dreaming of a high-octane ticket to paradise? Rejecting Jack Levy's rather diffident offers of help with further education and a career, the bright lad puts all his energies into qualifying to drive a truck, the sort of truck that can carry hazardous materials. In immediate post-9/11 New Jersey, this innocent ploy by a green young Islamist sets off no alarm bells at all. Ordinary life still manages to go on, as it must. At the high school's commencement festivities, Jack finds himself in the procession just behind a West Indian teacher, who really does address him as Mon, who says, "Jack, tell me, there is something I'm embarrassed to ask anyone. Who is this J-Lo? My students keep mentioning him." "Her. Singer. Actress," Jack calls ahead. "Hispanic. Very well turned out. Great ass, apparently." Yes, that's right. Updike has given us a black high school teacher who in the early years of this very century thinks that J-Lo is a guy, and who is embarrassed to ask more about the subject, and who therefore raises his voice at commencement and seeks enlightenment from a 63-year-old Jewish washout. Could anything be more hip and up to the minute? When this Updike feels for a pulse, know what I'm saying? He really, feels. Some pages later, we find Jack exclaiming, "No way," and the daring idiomatic usage is explained by his having picked up this much slang from his students. The expression was universal long before any of these students was born. Indeed, Updike continues to offer us, as we've come to expect of him, his grueling homework. The sinuous imam of the local mosque, Sheikh Rashid, does not try to impress the half-educated and credulous Ahmad with the duty to fight the enemies of the Prophet. Far from it. He prepares him for stone-faced single-mindedness with some intricate Quranic hermeneutics designed to shake his faith. And guess which example is adduced? The theory of the German Orientalist Christoph Luxemburg, who has argued that the virgins promised to martyrs in paradise are actually a mistranslation for white raisins. Bet you never heard that. My feeling, call it a guess or an intuition, is that this is not how madrasas train their suicide bombers. My other feeling is that Updike could have placed this rather second-hand show of his recent learning in some other part of the novel. But where would that be? Almost immediately after Ahmad's graduation, he's in the throes of a conspiracy that is too ingenious for words. While delivering furniture one day, he drops off an ottoman. Get it? That, when cut open in a sinister Muslim home tenanted only by men, proves to be stuffed with quantities of green American currency. The young inductee to terrorism cannot make out the denominations of these non-blue and non-brown notes, but to judge by the reverence with which the men are counting and arranging the bills on the tile-top table, the denominations are high. No bill is higher than 100, which doesn't buy you much high explosive these days. But one imagines, if one absolutely must, that a whole ottoman can also hold a goodly number of 1s and 5s. This novel and risky and cumbersome way of delivering cash only whets Ahmad's appetite for the more intoxicating surahs of the Quran. Before we can catch our breath, he's at the wheel of his jam-packed juggernaut of annihilation, and still registering strip malls and other urban deformities, and is pressing ahead with his desperate plan. Never mind that the plot has been exposed by a cunning last-minute call from the frumpy Washington bureaucrat sister to the impossibly bulbous homebound New Jersey sister. And never mind that this exposure has not led the forces of Homeland Security to close the Lincoln Tunnel. No. Stopping, Ahmad comes down to the crushed, demoralized Jack Levy, who manages with exquisite timing to flag down Ahmad's truck and climb aboard and talk him out of it at the very last available cinematic second. After I had sent Terrorist windmilling across the room in a spasm of boredom and annoyance, I retrieved it to check my notes in its margins. In Roger's version, I remembered, Updike had described blacks and Jews as the only magical people in America. In this sloppy latest effort, he becomes more inclusive. Here's Jack rhapsodizing about Ahmad's sluttish mamma, with whom he has a torrid moment in which this constant reader could not suspend disbelief. The Irish in her, he thinks. That's what he loves. That's what he can't do without. The moxie, the defiant spark of craziness people get if they're sat on long enough. The Irish have it, the blacks and Jews have it. But it's died in him. This is a fair enough attempt to push all the clichés about Irish Americans into one brief statement, and I can only think that it's put in as some kind of oblique tribute to the New York Fire Department on 9/11. Not for them the fate of the flabby, torpid, average Americans, thoughtlessly reaping by their very herd-like existence the whirlwind of jihadist revenge. When writing In the Beauty of the Lilies, which also opened its action in New Jersey, Updike gave us considerable insight into the Reverend Clarence Wilmot as he endured a full-dress crisis of Calvinist conscience. There was knowledge to be won from the portrayal, and some dry humour, and some imaginative sympathy. A good deal of work on the Presbyterian texts had been performed, and was lightly but learnedly deployed. With the coup, also, Updike had been somewhat in advance of the tremors that he was sensing. But he's now some considerable distance behind the story, giving the impression of someone who has been keeping up with the inside radical Islam features in something like Newsweek. It could be, I suppose, that he might write better about exotic religions if he kept his characters overseas in their exotic settings, and tried to make sense of them there. He includes one more religious set piece in Terrorist, of a charismatic black preacher jiving away at his congregation. Irrelevant to the plot, this is justified by the black girl in whom Ahmad is briefly interested. As if to confirm his loathing for American sexual degeneracy, she has a boyfriend pimp named Tylenol Jones, the sort of name that Tom Wolfe might come up with on a bad day. The novel's conclusion is much the same as that of Updike's New Yorker essay. He looks at the quotidian crowd in Manhattan, scuttling, hurrying, intent in the milky morning sun upon some plan or scheme or hope they are hugging to themselves. Their reason for living another day, each impaled live upon the pin of consciousness, fixed upon self-advancement and self-preservation. That, and only that. Insects, in fact. Ahmad resents them for taking away his God, and really one is hard put not to empathize with the poor boy. Given some admittedly stiff competition, Updike has produced one of the worst pieces of writing from any grown-up source since the events he has so unwisely tried to draw upon. John Updike, Part 2, Mr. Geniality. Review of Due Considerations, Essays and Criticism by John Updike. The New York Times Book Review, November 4th, 2007. The elements of this collection fully justify the rather modest promise offered by the title. All things are indeed considered, and they are mostly considered in a highly considerate manner. As to the due part, John Updike himself informs us, "Bills come due, dues must be paid. After 8 years, I was due for another collection of non-fictional prose." To which one might add that he seems determined to give everyone his or her due. Indeed, in a highly affable preface, he wonders if his only fault might be a tendency to be critical, in the ordinary sense of the term, at all. Rereading his book reviews, he wonders aloud if their customary geniality, almost effusive in the presence of a foreign writer or a factual topic, didn't somewhat sour when faced with a novel by a fellow countryman. Should he perhaps have been a little kinder to E.L. Doctorow, Don DeLillo, and Norman Rush, or, by implication, a fraction more harsh, with Ngugi Watsi Ongo and Haruki Murakami? Such scruple no doubt does its author credit, and yet customary genialities would surely have been a rather insipid title. In fact, on the sole occasion where Updike does display a hint of fang, it is in his treatment of Michel Houellebecq, whose novel, The Possibility of an Island, he is determined not to allow to shock him. Nonetheless, after giving a few graphic staves of Houellebecq's not always bracing combo of obscenity and nihilism, he comments mildly that a microcosm that excludes such things as parenting and compassion is wanting in verisimilitude, and concludes that the sensations Houellebecq gives us are not nutritive. By Updikean standards, this counts as a pretty stern condemnation. In partial contrast, when one consults the generous review of DeLillo's Cosmopolis, a notice that now causes its author such misgiving, we find the worst he can say is that the trouble with a tale where anything can happen is that somehow nothing happens. I can't see DeLillo exactly biting through his umbrella handle with rage on reading that lenient verdict. In a culture more and more dominated by dunces and frauds, it might be salutary if one of our senior critics laid about himself with a bit more brio. But Updike does not so much avoid this task as rise above it. He chooses to review classical authors, from Emerson to Proust, or among the living or contemporary, only those who meet some kind of gold standard, and he regards the responsibility of the reviewer to be the rendering of a fair précis of the work under consideration, where the word fair has inescapable consequences of its own. The nearest we get to a review of the popular is a treatment of George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman series, and again, amidst the punctilious summary of the subject's many admirable points, the few cautious reproaches tend to stand out. Which admirer of Fraser's cheerful potboilers would not concede that his historical endnotes are distractingly informative, or ruefully agree that to keep his pot boiling, Fraser keeps tossing fresh female bodies into it? I am myself familiar with the reviewing cliché from both ends of the business, so I say deliberately that Updike's scope is rather breathtaking, from Isaac Babel straight to James Thurber on successive pages, and I add that he seems almost incapable of writing badly. When I do not know the subject well, as in his finely illustrated art reviews of Bruegel, Dürer and Goya, I learn much from what Updike has to impart. When he considers an author I love, like Proust or Czesław Miłosz, I often find myself appreciating familiar things in a new way. I enjoy the little feuilletons he appends, for example on the 10 greatest moments of the American libido. And I admire the way he can construct a classical sentence that makes an abrupt, useful turn to the American demotic. Having patiently read both versions of Philip Larkin's collected poems, this reviewer believes that the second, chastened version, confining itself to the 4 trade volumes Larkin supervised and the uncollected poems published in other places, does give the verse itself a better shake. This appears in one of the best long treatments of Larkin's poetry I have ever read. Those of us who adore this work have a tendency to feel personally addressed by it and to resent any other commentators as interlopers. Updike seems almost to know what we're thinking. It's of interest also that his own vestigial Christianity, or do I mean surviving attachment to Christianity, proves on other pages to be not dissimilar to Larkin's own synthesis in Obeyed and in Church-Going, of a bleak materialism fused with an admiration for the liturgy and the architecture. I wrote yuck in the margin only twice, first when Updike describes Kierkegaard, in an otherwise very penetrating essay, as the Great Dane, and second when summarizing Peter Carey's Theft, a love story, he writes that someone turns up strangled in a Nice, not nice, hotel. One is much more inclined to make approving ticks, as when Updike notices the prehistory of Dr. O's ragtime character Coalhouse Walker in The March, or when he spots Tula Pokrivka, a minor Danzig character from Cat and Mouse and Dog Years, turning up again in Gunter Grass's Crab Walk. Yet it was in a paragraph of the Crab Walk review that I began to realize what was irritating me. Discussing Grass's rather recent discovery that Germans had also been the victims of atrocities, Updike asks, "Can a nation war against a regime without warring against the people the regime rules? Is the very concept war crime tautological, given the context of determined violence? As Kofi Annan, the United Nations Secretary-General, said a few weeks ago, war is always a catastrophe. Are discriminations possible between appropriate and excessive bombing, between legitimate and atrocious ship sinkings, between proper combat of armed soldiers and such tactics as using civilians, including children, as human shields, or disguising an ambush as a surrender? An American soldier recently wounded in such an ambush, when interviewed on television, shrugged and with striking dispassion conceded that, given the great imbalance of firepower between the coalition and Saddam Hussein's Iraq, he could hardly blame his attackers for their murderous ruse. This is even-handedness taken almost to the point of masochism. What of the imbalance between the jihadists and the girls' schools they blow up? And Updike doesn't choose to answer any of the questions, familiar enough at a sophomore level, as is Annan's affectless remark, that he poses. I have the suspicion that he's overcompensating for the rather lame defense of the war in Vietnam that he mounted in his memoir Self-Consciousness. The same thought recurred to me in a rereading of his offhand Talk of the Town report written for The New Yorker after he watched the collapse of the Twin Towers from across the river in Brooklyn Heights. War is conducted with a fury that requires abstraction, that turns a plane full of peaceful passengers, children included, into a missile the faceless enemy deserves. The other side has the abstractions. We have only the mundane duties of survivors, to pick up the pieces, to bury the dead, to take more precautions, to go on living. Really? Fair-mindedness here threatens to decline into something completely passive, neutral and inert. Come to think of it, what is the most celebrated statement about giving someone his due? Vidal Loco. Vanity Fair, February 2010. More than a decade ago, I sat on a panel in New York to review the life and work of Oscar Wilde. My fellow panellist was that heroic old queen, Quentin Crisp, perhaps the only man ever to have made a success of the part of Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Earnest. Inevitably, there arose the question, is there an Oscar Wilde for our own day? The moderator proposed Gore Vidal, and really, once that name had been mentioned, there didn't seem to be any obvious rival. Like Wilde, Gore Vidal combined tough-mindedness with subversive wit. The Importance of Being Earnest is actually a very mordant satire on Victorian England, and had the rare gift of being amusing about serious things as well as serious about amusing ones. Like Wilde, he was able to combine radical political opinions with a lifestyle that was anything but solemn. And also, like Wilde, he was almost never off. His private talk was as entertaining and shocking as his more prepared public appearances. Admirers of both men and of their polymorphous perversity could happily debate whether either of them was better at fiction or in the essay form. I was fortunate enough to know Gore a bit in those days. The price of knowing him was exposure to some of his less adorable traits, which included his pachydermatous memory for the least slight or grudge, and a very, very minor tendency to bring up the Jewish question in context where it didn't quite belong. One was made aware, too, that he suspected Franklin Roosevelt of playing a dark hand in bringing on Pearl Harbor, and still nurtured an admiration in his breast for the dashing Charles Lindbergh, leader of the American isolationist right in the 1930s. But these tics and eccentricities, which I did criticize in print, seemed more or less under control, and meanwhile he kept on saying things one wished one had said oneself. Of a certain mushy spiritual writer named Idris Shah, these books are a great deal harder to read than they were to write. Of a paragraph by Herman Wouk, this is not at all bad, except as prose. He once said to me of the late Teddy Kennedy, who was then in his low period of red-faced, engorged and abandoned boyhood, that he exhibited all the charm of 300 pounds of condemned veal. Who but Gore could begin a discussion by saying that the three most dispiriting words in the English language were Joyce Carol Oates? In an interview, he told me that his life's work was making sentences. It would have been more acute to say that he made a career out of pronouncing them. However, if it's true even to any degree that we were all changed by September the 11th, 2001, it's probably truer of Vidal that it made him more the way he already was, and accentuated a crackpot strain that gradually asserted itself as dominant. If you look at his writings from that time, thrown together in a couple of cheap paperbacks entitled Dreaming War and Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, you'll find the more crass notions of Michael Moore or Oliver Stone being expressed in language that falls some distance short of the Wildian ideal. Meanwhile, media was assigned its familiar task of inciting public opinion against Osama bin Laden, still not the proven mastermind. To that sentence, abysmal as it is in so many ways, Vidal put his name in November 2002. A small anthology of half-argued and half-written shock pieces either insinuated or asserted that the administration had known in advance of the attacks on New York and Washington, and was seeking a pretext to build a long-desired pipeline across Afghanistan. Not much sign of that, incidentally, not that the luckless Afghans mightn't welcome it. For academic authority in this grassy knoll enterprise, Vidal relied heavily on the man he thought produced the best, most balanced report on 9/11, a certain Navis Mossadegh Ahmet of the Institute for Policy Research and Development, whose book, The War on Freedom, had been brought to us by what Vidal called a small but reputable homeland publisher. Mr. Ahmet, on inspection, proves to be a risible individual wedded to half-baked conspiracy-mongering, his institute a one-room sideshow in the English seaside town of Brighton, and his publisher an outfit called Media Monitors Network, in association with Tree of Life, whose now-deceased website used to offer advice on the ever-awkward question of self-publishing. And to think that there was once a time when Gore Vidal could summon Lincoln to the pages of a novel or dispute points of strategy with Henry Cabot Lodge. It became more and more difficult to speak to Vidal after this, and less fun too. But then I noticed something about his last volume of memoirs, Point-to-Point Navigation, which brought his life story up to 2006. Though it contained a good ration of abuse directed at Bush and Cheney, it didn't make even a gesture to the wild-eyed and croaking stuff that Mr. Ahmet had been purveying. This meant one of two things. Either Vidal didn't believe it any longer, or he wasn't prepared to put such sorry, silly, sinister stuff in a volume published by Doubleday, read by his literary and intellectual peers, and dedicated to the late Barbara Epstein. The second interpretation, while slightly contemptible, would be better than nothing, and certainly a good deal better than the first. But I have now just finished reading a long interview conducted by Johann Hari of the London Independent, Hari being a fairly consecrated admirer of his, in which Vidal decides to go slumming again, and to indulge the lowest in himself and in his followers. He openly says that the Bush administration was probably in on the 9/11 attacks, a criminal complicity that would certainly fit them to a T, that Timothy McVeigh was a noble boy, no more murderous than Generals Patton and Eisenhower, and that Roosevelt saw to it that we got that war by inciting the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. Coming a bit more up to date, Vidal says that the whole American experiment can now be described as a failure. The country will soon take its place somewhere between Brazil and Argentina, where it belongs. President Obama will be buried in the wreckage broken by the madhouse after the United States has been humiliated in Afghanistan and the Chinese emerge supreme. We shall then be the yellow man's burden, and Beijing will have us running the coolie cars, or whatever it is they have in the way of transport. Asian subjects never seem to bring out the finest in Vidal. He used to say it was Japan that was dominating the world economy, and that in the face of that other peril, there is now only one way out. The time has come for the United States to make common cause with the Soviet Union. That was in 1986, not perhaps the ideal year to have proposed an embrace of Moscow, and certainly not as good a year as 1942, when Franklin Roosevelt did join forces with the USSR against Japan and Nazi Germany, in a war that Vidal never ceases to say was A, America's fault, and B, not worth fighting. Rounding off his interview, an obviously shocked Mr. Hari tried for a change of pace and asked Vidal if he felt like saying anything about his recently deceased rivals John Updike, William F. Buckley Jr. and Norman Mailer. He didn't manage to complete his question before being interrupted. Updike was nothing. Buckley was nothing, with a flair for publicity. Mailer was a flawed publicist too, but at least there were signs every now and then of a working brain. One sadly notices, as with the foregoing barking and effusions, the utter want of any grace or generosity, as well as the entire absence of any wit or profundity. Sarcastic, tired flippancy has stolen the place of the first, and lugubrious resentment has deposed the second. Oh, just in closing then, since Vidal was in London, did he have a word to say about England? This isn't a country, it's an American aircraft carrier. Good grief. For some years now, the old boy's stock in trade has been that of the last Roman, the stoic eminence who with unclouded eyes foresees the coming end of the noble republic. Such an act doesn't require a toga, but it does demand a bit of dignity. Vidal's phrasings sometimes used to have a certain rotundity and extravagance, but now he has descended straight to the cheap and even to the counterfeit. What business does this patrician have in the gutter markets where paranoids jabber and the coinage is debased by every sort of vulgarity? If Vidal ever reads this, I suppose I know what he will say. Asked about our differences a short while ago at a public meeting in New York, he replied, "You know, he identified himself for many years as the heir to me, and unfortunately for him, I didn't die. I just kept going on and on and on." One report of the event said that this not-so-rapier-like reply had the audience in stitches. Vidal, in his decline, has fans like David Letterman's, who laugh in all the wrong places, lest they suspect themselves of not having a good time. But his first sentence precisely inverts the truth. Many years ago, he wrote to me unprompted, I have the correspondence, and freely offered to nominate me as his living successor, Dauphin, or as the Italians put it, Delfino. He very kindly inscribed a number of his own books to me in this way, and I asked him for permission to use his original letter on the jacket of one of mine. I stopped making use of the endorsement after 9/11, as he well knows. I have no wish to commit literary patricide or to assassinate Vidal's character, a character which appears in any case to have committed suicide. I don't in the least mind his clumsy and nasty attempt to rewrite his history with me, but I find I do object to the crank revisionist and denialist history he's now peddling about everything else, as well as to the awful, spiteful, miserable way going on and on and on, indeed, in which he has finished up by doing it. Oscar Wilde was never mean-spirited, and never became an ancient mariner either.
End of Disc 3.